It's the 5th century BC. The Peloponnesian War will soon start. The great warrior city of Sparta is consolidating its dominance over the Greek peninsula. Athens has a population of about 500,000, including nearly 300,000 slaves. The Persian Empire, the largest in the world, is quivering to invade the Achaeans and finally dominate the entire East Sea. In the meanwhile, on a peninsula on the outskirts of the cultural, military, and economic center of the world, a small city-state ousted its kings barely a century before. Etruscan foreigners who preyed on dictatorial tendencies and antagonized older subjects, forming a peculiar form of government, a republic in which nobles and commoners, patricians and plebeians, the Senate and Comitii coexist at the apex of power, Rome. In this century, the city that was to become eternal faces an expansionist period for the first time in its history, and it is pressed in all its directions by different enemies. To the north, the threat is the Etruscan Dodecapolis, always watched closely by the Romans after the end of the monarchy. To the south, all the peoples of the so-called Latium Vetus, Old Latium, among which, first and foremost after Rome, both in terms of military strength and proximity, there were the Volsci. Finally, to the east were all the Umbrian peoples, the vanguard of which were the Equi, who continually pressed the city's countryside with raids and plunder. It is in this context of huge ethnic, linguistic, and religious fragmentation that in the very early years of the Republic, Romans tried at times to defend themselves, and at others to subjugate these different people, honing the same set of skills and cultural values that would have allowed them later to take control of the Mediterranean basin and Western Europe at large. In the 5th century, war had become a tradition for almost all the consuls of Rome. Cases of peace lasting for more than 365 days were quite rare. The normal cycle of the year was represented by an annual defensive war against the Equi and Volscians, under close observation from the Etruscan cities that from time to time sent the raid, especially from the city of Veio. In this context of continuous warfare, with alternating fortunes for practically 100 years, there came also a moment when everything changed, the turning point, the Battle of Mount Algidus. It is hard to imagine thinking about the huge empire Rome would have become, but these dark forests at the edge of this ancient volcano were the southernmost borders of the territory of the Eternal City, on top of a ridge which looks at the Pontine marshes and the sea, after which other Italic tribes dwelt and developed. It was a perfect place to give battle, almost precisely halfway between Rome and the Equi and Volsci territories, on an elevated plain that allowed its first occupants to control any movement of the enemy, and finally, at its summit, presented a good plain that allowed both to camp safely and to face enemies in pitched battle if necessary. Many times the armies of Latium have clashed on this mountain sacred to Diana, seeing the legions triumph almost constantly, but this time, almost suddenly, the unthinkable happened. The Consular army is surrounded. Equi and Volscians have joined forces. Some Etruscan cities offered support, encircling the Romans. The besiegers only have to wait for them to die of hunger and thirst, for the soldiers to rebel against their generals and to raise the white flag. In short, time is allied with the people of ancient Latium. Rome can finally be destroyed just by waiting, and then rampaging through the countryside. It was not too long before news of the legion's conditions reached Rome. The situation was desperate, hysteria reigned in the city. The Senate did not know what to do. The popular committees hoped for a defeat of the consuls to claim power over Rome. It is precisely then, how will often happen for the next 1,000 years, that the gaze is turned to one man, to someone who, without political, economic, and military intrigues could lift the fortunes of all of Rome, a dictator. Rome was a city-state, governed in the form of a republic, which at this very moment is facing a decisive moment in its young history. Far from being the well-trodden political system of the following centuries, it is always prey to conflicts, internal and external. Patricians and plebeians would constantly struggle for power, the first sanctioning the tribes, that is, the people who formed Rome following its first king Romulus, possessing the birthright that would give them exclusive use of the highest offices of the government, a right that would be constantly contested by that segment of the population that the Republic found in its peasants, its workers, and above all its soldiers, who at the time of need were summoned by the consul on duty. Surveyed and subdivided into legions, they were called to be ready to die to defend their homeland. These will be the centuries in which dramatic events will take place, seeing the people unite in the Comitii Curiati, conquering all their fundamental political rights that will found the very idea of Roman democracy. Following their infamous succession, the office of the tribune of the plebs will be created, whose function and characteristics will probably make it unique up to that point in human history. This magistrate was elected by the people and by the people only. He possessed an absolute right of veto over any law or initiative put in place by the Senate, the consuls, and even a possible dictator. He could enunciate capital punishment on anyone who harmed the Republic, and above all, enjoyed sacredness. That is, his figure was untouchable, and anyone who harmed him in any way was as if they were striking down the gods themselves, making him effectively immune to any political repercussion, threat, concussion, or intimidation. If the situation inside was always at risk, the situation outside was no less problematic. If the kings had already conquered many neighboring cities and already founded some colonies, it was just now that Rome, without Etruscan support any longer, had to defend itself against any external threat. If many will be the conquered cities, many will be the others that will subjugate themselves voluntarily in exchange for protection, in the ancient ritual of the granting of fides. In this context of expansion and institution of public life, there were also the very first powerful rivals that Romans had to deal with in order to ensure their survival: the Equi from the east and the Volsci from the south. There will be frequent clashes, with constant sacking of the Roman countryside, and several different wars and battles, many of them right on the Algid plain. Or in all, those events pointed to a very difficult truth to swallow. In order to endure, Rome could not coexist with its neighbors. Its survival depended on it. It is precisely in this context of continuous war and furious struggle that the Battle of Mount Algidus took place. Two events quickly led to disaster. On the one hand, an unexpected actor, represented by the Equi army. By surprise, it managed to catch the city, sacking its countryside all the way below the walls and forcing the then consul Gaius Nautilius Rutilius to run back. The other consul, Lucius Minucius Esquilinus Augurinus, instead, continued his march to take up position on the mountain, from the top of which any enemy movement could be seen, blocking way to the heart of Roman territory and giving the advantage in case of any possible attack. This was the second ace up the sleeve of the ancient people of Latium. A Roman exile named Gracchus Clelius, who well expected this move, united the two armies and locked the consul in an encirclement. It is said that only 5 horsemen managed to escape the enemy's grip and bring the news to Rome. It is then that a former consul, Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, is asked to intervene and save the city by being appointed dictator, a political figure seldom seen in Roman history because of his exceptional function. In the Roman Republic, the dictator was a magistrate whose office lasted for a year, totally entrusted with every aspect of the Republic, the laws, the treasury, the power to summon armies and lead them in war, choosing other magistrates and virtually every military and civil function of the state. All this because it was assumed that the crisis Rome was facing was so severe that there was no time to waste in the usual struggles between the Senate and the Comitii. One man was needed, righteous, rich in virtue, given the power to do essentially whatever he deemed necessary to overcome the drastic situation. Thinking about Rome's sacred values, the Mos Maiorum, people often tend to cast a unified imagery in which the Roman Empire is always the same throughout its history. Yet, when thinking of honor, pietas, democracy, and the moral legacy to which also Roman writers often refer to, the early days of the Republic could not be more unique. If, for example, we were to compare with later dictators as the likes of Sulla, or even Caesar himself, who exploited much of their dictatorial powers in order to further their personal agenda, The example of the Battle of Mount Algidus and Cincinnatus shows how much different things were centuries before. Cincinnatus, who had formerly been a consul of Rome, willingly decided after the end of his term to retire to his plot of land, miserable enough for that matter, which he cultivated personally. And when called to sacred duty, he immediately responded, accepting the powers bestowed upon him and the task being given. To understand the ending of the struggle of Mount Algidus, turning to Titus Livy, one of the greatest ancient historians, we could use his recount in the book Ab Urbe Condita, which follows. During the following year, because of the blockade of a Roman army on Mount Algidus about 12 miles from the city, Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, who owned only 4 acres of land and cultivated it with his own hands, was appointed dictator. He found himself at work, engaged in plowing, wiped off his sweat, wore the toga praetexta, accepted the office, defeated his enemies, and released the army. In less than 2 weeks from being appointed dictator, Cincinnatus was able to raise a new legion, defeat all the enemies of Rome besieging the consular army on the slopes of Mount Algidus. More incredibly than that, right after having done so, in a condition of absolute power over the city, he decided to immediately give it up, while he could have still continued to keep it throughout the year. In this sense, the Battle of Mount Algidus is an invaluable example to understand the very restrictive and even bigoted moral fiber later Romans writers referred to. If on the one hand, during the late Republic and early Empire, politicians, thinkers, and writers often quote this ideal set of Roman values, identifying them in their own people, on the other, it is certainly true that the political figures of their time did not act upon them. So, what were they referring to? The example of Cincinnatus living his life devoid of any vice, saving the city, and immediately giving power and privileges perfectly embodies the spirit of the ancients, which would have later been called the Mos Maiorum, which allowed Rome to become the predominant power in central Italy and have the strength to be able to defy any threat, even the terrible 12 Etruscan cities. But that is another story.